And yes, we are live. I'm here with my new friend Steve Babb. How are you doing?
I'm doing good today. How about yourself?
Did I pronounce Babb properly, or did I overemphasize the double B at the end there?
No, I don't. Let's see, Babb. Just
Babb.
Babb, Babb.
That's pretty cool. What kind of name is that?
Well, I think that's an English name, but I came by it through a Cherokee 100 years or so ago,
Oh,
who given the name.
oh,
That's anyway, probably in the late 1800s.
wow, very cool.
We're a
I'm
very thin grain of Babb. There's no cousins. There's no.
wow, very cool. I'm gonna get you to talk us through sort of your whole journey. I don't know how old you are today, but
I think
however, oh yeah, 60.
63. Yeah.
So you have a lot of history to cover, but on my podcast, I like to get this sort of faith and philosophy angle. So was there any, religion per se or different philosophies? It might even be a political philosophy that was dominant or prominent in your upbringing, and sort of paint a little picture to the extent that you're comfortable talking about the parents, grandparents, siblings, whatever, in terms of maybe some of the context, like if a lot of your relatives are of a certain persuasion or whatever, you can talk about that, put some context. But it's more about you and your journey, and if you went down some rabbit holes in terms of this worldview or that worldview, because we all do. I've been down many myself. So just
Yes,
talk us
sir.
through that whole thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a tall order. But yeah, I mean, I guess you'd say I come from a Southern um, conservative upbringing. Um, we were I was raised in a Baptist church, and the music started, I guess, there,
Mm-hmm.
and then public school music classes. But um, I ended up taking piano lessons. It was a small church, and it was the kind of congregation where if you could do something, you were put to work. So by I think 12, they had me as a full-time pianist there, and it's me and another little girl that we swapped back and forth. So my first, um, I guess, music was actual like hymns and things like that. But I was taking lessons, and it was all, faith was just something that was. It was not something that I viewed. I didn't feel like there was a secular life and a church life, so to speak. It was all one life. That's how I was raised to believe, and so yeah, that's kind of the short version of it. But
Were you ever an atheist, agnostic, or were you always Christian in your heart? Do you always pray? What's the journey there? Or have you cooled off and sort of drifted away from
well,
Christianity?
yeah, I peeled off. So I had that same upbringing in that very same church. Later, I guess I was probably 17 or so. I began to try to think, what am I going to do with my life professionally? And I had this bizarre notion that I wanted to be a rock star, and I would be a rock star for Jesus,
Ah,
And I sort of invented the whole Christian rock thing in my head when I was probably 16 or 17, um, and then somebody asked me, I think as a pastor, asked me in church, in front of a class, well, what do you want to be? And I said, I want to be a rock star. And he said, well, and he, kind of everybody got quiet. And he said, will you just be the very best one? And I'm like, yay. So that's all, like literally all the encouragement. And, but boy, I don't know, it was within a year of that, um, as I began to follow through on this, the church pulled back away from me big time. They did the church I was at did not approve, and partly I understand why, because rock bands can be a bit notorious for the way they live, but I had a genuine desire to do it correctly. Um, Nevertheless, that sort of pushed me out of the church for a while, and so for a number of years, um, I didn't. I didn't really, although I read about other religions and other beliefs, I couldn't really make myself ever go there. No matter what I did, and this would be through my early 20s, no matter what I would say out loud to people, when I would go to bed at night, I would pray. So I was kind of running from God, I think, for a while. But yeah, I would always come back to Him at night going, I don't mean it. I don't mean it. I don't mean it.
Cute.
Die right
Very.
now.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
cute. When's the last time you prayed sincerely?
Prayed sincerely.
Yeah,
Oh,
last night.
maybe an hour. Yeah, yeah. I keep an open channel. I
Cool.
keep an open. So yeah. So by I'd say my late 20s, 26, 27, I began to start coming back around. I met um, my wife at about that time. She was a big encouragement to me. I guess I was 27 when I met her, and was playing in a sort of a Christian rock band. So there was lots of talk about God again, and but the big key thing for me was C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, which when I discovered that book, it made it opened it up in a different way for me. Faith could be something that was sort of had an intellectual um, bent to it with C.S. Lewis. I respond very well to the way he wrote and things he thought and the things he said, and that's when my journey back began.
Wow, incredible. What was the name of the Christian band you were part of?
Oh, you know, it went under 3 or 4 different names, and it was there were 2 or 3 very sincere Christians in that group, um, and but it there was something going on, I think, in that whole movement back then. It was probably one of the worldliest bands I played in, to be honest. Yeah, so something I'm particularly crazy about.
Have you ever heard about this may be a silly question since you know a lot about music, but Glass Harp and Phil Keaggy, I believe
Yeah,
he's Christian. I believe he became
he,
Christian or something.
he is, and I believe we may have even played on the same project at some point. I know I've recorded another artist who had him on his album, and we worked with some of his tracks. I've never met the man, but I think we've been somehow involved, maybe.
And is your wife is she musical? Is she part of uh
Yeah,
your bands?
she's she was a pianist growing up, but and been my she's been the accountant for,
Ah,
for and the photographer. She wears many hats. She doesn't play in the group or anything, but she does has helped me for the whole 30-year career of Glasshammer.
wow. Very cool. So, you didn't go back to your Baptist minister and sort of thumb the nose?
Well, I mean, and I'm let's see, did I thumb the nose? No, no, and like my feeling on all that softened over the years because I think they loved me, and I think they cared about which direction I was going in, and um, it's just a different era. When the little piano player from the church suddenly has long hair and an earring and wears spandex and runs around the stage, and they didn't know what to think about that, and that would have been 19 what 80 79 something like that, 78 70. So I don't hold it against anybody.
Without, making a public display of all your sins, was there a lot of sex and drugs with the rock and roll for you?
Oh, well, I would never. That would be going too far into it, but uh, suffice it to say, I definitely went out into the world for a while.
Okay, good enough. So, when I interviewed Stuart Goldring from Gnitterlog, and we're going to talk a little bit about Prague, 70s Prague later if you're into it. I hope so. He said they were pretty clean cut compared to most bands, and they really rehearsed and they didn't do drugs. And not even sex. You know, they weren't really into that. It's a pair of Jewish twin brothers that founded that band. It's a
Okay.
rather obscure band. I don't know if you know their music, but it's amazing. Another band I love is Gentle Giant. That's another two Jewish brothers in that band too.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know. Uh, I just it's on my playlist. I lost my head.
Okay.
Uh, I've been listening to that in the car quite a bit lately.
I love it. It's one of my favorites. I just discovered it as an adult. I
Yeah.
grew up listening to primarily Soft Machine, Vandergraaf Generator, Caravan, Canterbury Scene, Gong also.
Right.
You,
Yeah.
you like that stuff?
I do like that stuff. I did a kind of a Canterbury style album once in the late '90s with a band called Valari that you might like if you can find it. They were from Athens, Georgia, and they're instrumental prog, kind of jazzy. They refer to it as Canterbury. And then I was a camel doesn't really cross over into that
I
really.
like that.
Yeah, but I was still a big Camel fan. But yeah, as far as like the craziness of rock bands, prog bands don't really have time for that stuff. So, but by the time I was in Glass Hammer, I'm a happily married man, and we didn't. I don't certainly didn't want drugs involved in the band or any craziness like that for sure.
It's highly technical music.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot involved in learning it, playing it, and writing it, and it's not really a kind of a party crowd, as far as fan base goes.
Yeah. It's just a bunch of. I sometimes watch on YouTube some 70s prog concerts or whatever. And it's just a bunch of 20 something, mostly men, just sitting quietly listening, maybe nod a little bit. It's like.
Well, they're all 60s now, and that's what they still do.
Yeah. It's amazing. So do you agree? Do you agree that there's a spiritual element to music? Because there's something about a certain melody that can make me cry or make me feel
Yeah,
uplifted. What is that?
yeah. Huh. Well,
Explain it to us.
um, I told my wife this a while ago because um, it's not easy to talk about. Uh, what's easy to do is to put it into motion, like with music, or even in the book that I'm working on, or the one I've written. Um, it's easier for me to express it artistically than it is for me to explain it to somebody. But like my process for me is that beginning any project, and this has been the case ever since Glass Hammer started, I pray. Uh, and it's almost a selfish prayer because I don't view this as I don't view Glass Hammer as a Christian band, and never had. It's a business, and my first uh, mission with a business like this, with a band, is to entertain people. Even though it's progressive rock, they're either going to be entertained or they're not. They don't think of it that way, but that's the case. So that's my first job. But I want my faith to be reflected in my work, just like I think a lot of us do, whatever our trade happens to be. Nevertheless, I pray for God to be involved in what I'm doing, that He will help me to do things beyond my own known ability, and I invite Him into the process. And what's happened to me um, is no matter what I set out to write. This is true on many Glass Hammer albums. It all comes back to some sort of a theme that's running through all of these albums, and I can only imagine that's the story he wants me to tell. I think that's what's going on. Uh, but that being said, I think that he speaks through anything he wants to. Um, frankly, we can see him in the sunset. We can see him in nature. Um, and I've heard him in the music of bands that were completely secular or certainly non-Christian bands. I'll give you a for instance that was kind of personal to me was the song "Awakened" by Yes.
Oh,
I don't know if you've ever heard that, but if you haven't heard it, you should definitely check it out. It's on the album "Going for the One." I took me for years, I think, to try to figure out what was going on with that song. But it finally, the word transcendent uh, came to mind, and it's a song that it is a rock band, even if it's a very complicated progressive rock band, intellectually complicated. Um, their lyrics are always real, poetic, and it's very strange lyrics. But even though that's who they were, somehow what happened in that one song transcended anything I've ever heard in rock ever before that, and certainly since. Um, I got to meet with the singer, the original singer for that band is John Anderson.
Wow, he's one of my favorites. He's so cute and tiny and funny.
Elf. But I got to be involved with him on for a little while, and went out to his house, uh, and he ended up guesting on one of our albums, which was great.
Which one?
He's on the album Culture of Ascent. We did a cover of South Side of the Sky that he sings on, and then I wrote a song called Life by Light, which, if you kind of want to see what I'm talking about, check that album out, and especially that song Life by Light, because it sort of sums up a lot of what I'm trying to say. But he tells me, I talked to him about the song Awaken. Well, what's that all about? Because I had heard that he had originally been inspired by a book of poetry written by a Baptist minister. Now, this is, John Anderson's not a Christian, but he'd found this book, and I think the guy's name was Calvin Miller. Was the pastor. A very intense. I don't know how to describe the book, but very strange poetry. I actually got to meet Calvin Miller at a breakfast at our church one time, and asked him about it. I was like, "Did you know that you inspired what I think may be the greatest rock song ever written?" He had no idea. He knew that Reba McEntire had written a song about it, however, but he didn't know who Yes was or any of that. But back to John Anderson, I asked him, and he gave me some really interesting anecdotes about how some of the music was. But he told me that the whole band knew, when they listened back to what they'd done, that something else was going on there, that it was more than it had gone beyond the band, and he never understood what it was, but it was something, and they never quite figured it out. And of course, I have my theories about what it is. If you listen to it, it involves there's a pipe organ, there's choir, and just some of the most gorgeous, uplifting music, just spectacular. And that song probably set me on a course to try to at least duplicate that feeling that I got.
Amazing. I purchased digital copies of several of your albums based on feedback from progarchives.com. I don't know if you know that. Okay, these are the ones I've got, and I'm gonna have to go through and listen to them. I'm just gonna list them, and then you can tell me sort of your favorites, okay? So
Okay.
I got Paralandra,
Uh-huh.
Lex Rex,
Mhm.
Shadowlands, The
Mhm.
Inconsolable Secret, which is my favorite so far.
Thank you.
Uh,
Yeah, I think it's
Culture
mine.
Culture of Ascent, which I now I'm excited to hear. I'm excited to listen to that one. If
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Perilous, The Breaking of the World,
Yeah.
Valkyrie, and Arise. Arise is the one that has that very different sounding song that I posted on Twitter. Is it you that you manage your Twitter account?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds
I
to
saw,
me that sounds like Steve Hillage from Gong. He did a lot of electronics and guitar.
well, yeah, I saw what you said on Twitter too. I was going to tell you, I don't know that much about Steve Hillage, other than there was one really cool song he covered by George Harrison. Uh, it's called,
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
a friend of mine, one of the guys that got me into prog rock, it was on some mixtape he made for me, and I wore the thing out. It's just like a happy kind of song, and then this shred space metal kind of killer guitar solo over the end of it. I just always loved it. And then he had some. Did he? Was he not associated with Hawkwind? Um,
Probably, yeah. And I love Hawkwind and Orb, the Orb later. The Orb was
right.
there. The Orb. Yeah, I
So
love
yeah,
Hawkwind, that stoner space rock stuff. It's just because it's a trance.
yeah,
It's just like I
it,
trip out.
yeah.
Carpet of Sound.
Uh,
From the albums that I mentioned to you, which one is your favorite? You maybe gave me a hint that it's the same as mine.
oh, well, Inconsolable Secret was probably the most important album to me, and that it kind of spawned this whole fantasy thing that I started. Wrote a book of poetry to go with it, and then borrowed from that world I created for that album, and had written another book, and that's turned it into a series. So something that happened on that album that just kind of really never left me. So
Are you allowed
yeah,
to talk? Are you allowed to talk about sort of the Coles Notes world? The what's the world? Who are the characters? What's the plot? Are you allowed to talk about that, or is that for the person to invent and discover on their own when they listen?
well, musically, I like it that people can kind of, it's very hard to tell a literal story in music. I've tried it, and it's it's difficult. Um, so that's why that album required, it was a 19,000 word poem at the time to kind of accompany it, to make it look like it's what used to call it wonder art. Some big all-encompassing piece of art that had art or actual painting and maybe poetry or fiction and narrative and lyrics and music, and so that was a big deal for us to pull that album off. But we determined early on that a big album like that, the music we were contemplating doing should be the soundtrack for something, and it didn't exist yet. So that's what made me write. And so there's just a lot of a feeling, I guess, of spiritual feeling associated with that album. Um, Somewhat inspired maybe by Tolkien,
Yeah,
Tolkien's essay, fairy stories about myths that actually were true, or the fairy tales that were actually true. Um, and he's referring to the crucifixion, I think, when he talks about that sort of thing. So yeah,
very
that's
cool.
the big deal for me. And the world is it's a very it's a mirror of our own, I think, just in the lens through the lens of fantasy. So there's the monsters are somewhat more visible than they are in our own world.
The Elfin Ship. Do you remember that book, The Elfin Ship? Who was that by? James Blaylock.
I don't know that book.
A pagan friend of mine, he recommended, he said it's his favorite nonfiction or fiction to read. It's this
Hmm.
fantasy. It's actually Christian fantasy because the guy's a Christian that wrote it. He's an American guy, but I just started reading. It's so cute. It's got that kind of Hobbit kind of vibe to it, but it's an American author, which it's quite a different sensibility. But Blaylock, you might want to check him out. But
I'll do.
yeah,
Yeah, my book about the book of poetry was very. Um, it's inspired somewhat by pre-Raphaelite arts. It's all kind of Arthurian, the way it came across. But the book, uh, and it's also tied into not the album Arise, but the three previous. I did what I called a sword and sorcery trilogy of albums about a character from this world I created. Um, anyway, all that to say, I don't even know where I was going with that, but
so I got a couple questions for you.
yeah,
One thing, if I could level a criticism against your music, it's that it's too good, it's too perfect. I don't hear any mistakes, and I don't certainly don't hear, chaos. It's a very controlled thing, and if you do have controlled chaos, I feel the control. And what I like about the 70s, this is just personal taste, I'm not trying to insult you, but what I like about the 70s is they were kind of just like discovering, experimenting, making a lot of mistakes. So
yeah,
I'm just wondering, I've heard people say that the live experience is very good too, excellent. And I'm just wondering, are you allowed to make mistakes? Because if I go and see you live, I want to hear some organic looseness.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
just all very perfect and tight on your albums. Are you aware of that? Have you heard that criticism before?
Well, I leveled it at myself at some point because I felt like, now let me go back and just explain. For a long time when I was in my early 20s and starting to listen to prog rock, I was listening to things like Tangerine Dream.
Okay. Oh, okay.
To me, became progressive rock that maybe aren't considered that now. But also part of that was the ear candy uh, aspect, like listening to an album like Close to the Edge and putting headphones on, all the interesting, cool things that were going on. And it was a little rawer, I guess, that early or the 70s prog. So production became important to me, and Fred Schindel, who I worked with, and we began to try to kind of create these audio file packages. Like the album wouldn't just be a band playing songs; they were really designed to be, intense audio experiences. And after a while, I began to feel that it had all become too polite, um, and maybe a little too produced. And I did realize that people weren't responding to it quite the way that I thought or hoped they would. And it wasn't as important to them as I thought it would be. So we loosened up the production a good bit on the album Valkyrie.
Mm.
It was all the rhythm tracks for that album are done live.
Ooh.
Uh, so we tried to kind of put it into a room like you would have done in the 70s, where we're all in a giant room working together and recording together. If you listen to that, it's definitely got a raw edge to it. And then I'd say some of these later albums like Dreaming City, some of that rawness I think is still there. I'm still very much a fan of just having that really nice, crazy. I mean, I think I like the chaos. I think it just may not come across in the music.
What about this brings to mind? Thank you for that explanation. It's beautiful, and I just want to again say it's very subjective. Music is very subjective. I've tried so hard. I've tried so hard to fall in love with Genesis, the early Genesis, and I just can't. I just don't like it. So music is very subjective.
Yeah.
And it's also my adolescence. Like I'm brainwashed by what I used to listen to during my adolescence. That's what I'm addicted to. But I'm definitely gonna be listening to a lot of that your albums and every album that I bought. And was there one in there that I listed that I didn't list that you think I should check out?
Did you get Perilous?
Yep.
Okay, because I just listened to that the other night for the first time in probably 10 years, and I got teary eyed.
Cool.
An interesting experience because
Very,
that album to me, the story behind it, I think, and I think you'd enjoy it if you take it as a whole. It's intended to be kind of one big journey. um, I would have loose there's some things I'd redo about it if I could, but it's still a really good album.
very cool. Um, I got a couple of topics that we can touch on. One of them is punk rock. My band Gnitterlog that I love. They made all of their money abandoning prog and going into punk rock, and they made a lot of money doing that. It's called the Pork Dukes. I don't know if you've heard about the Pork Dukes, but it's kind of raunchy, pornographic music. But it's catchy. I like punk because it's
Yeah.
catchy, and the big myth about punk is that they're not talented musicians. They're very, very talented musicians. Most of the punk artists that we know about are very talented, skilled musicians. Some of them classically trained. Even it's hilarious. The mythos around punk, but it is
Right.
good. It is good music. So I just want to get your feedback on punk, and then I want to talk about the Canadian prog band, which I don't really like, which is Rush. My wife loves it, but it's too heavy for me.
Man. So punk, it's interesting because I was, being 63, I was probably, 1975, 76, I was 16, and punk was really starting to explode. But I was from a small town, so it didn't really explode there that much. But, we heard about the Sex Pistols and they were on the news, and it was, so, but I did have a friend, a really good friend of mine that was a prog rock friend. That was his deal. And he was also a guitar player. And he got into punk and trashed the whole progressive rock scene. gave me all his albums.
No
And
way.
that's the thing. That was, yeah, it was, if I hadn't had all that, he gave me his Yes albums and what else, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and things like that, and Black Sabbath. He had some Sabbath albums, and all those things sort of got my head at 17 uh, to form, you know, my own musical journey. But I played. I mean, he and I played in a sort of a backyard band, garage band, punk rock band in the late 70s. And I wasn't into the political aspect of it at all. Probably wasn't even aware of it. But I just like that aggressive music. Uh, some of what the Sex Pistols did, and I can't remember all the bands he was into, but we screwed around with all that stuff.
Well, and then Rush, you want to gush about Rush? I do like it. It's just too heavy. It's just too heavy. It's too much like, and his screechy voice sometimes is a bit much for me. Farewell to Kings, I think, is one that I find a little bit more up my alley, just with that storytelling kind of medieval kind
Yeah.
of thing. But
So I discovered Rush when I was 15 or 16 because I was flipping through albums and I saw on the back of the album Fly By Night was a song called Rivendell. And I was a major Tolkien fan, and I'm like, had to have the album. So that's how I found them. And then went to see them. That was one of my first concerts. And they were such a nerdy, not particularly popular group that it just appealed to me at that time of my life, you know. Um, I had guy friends that were into it. We were just, and musicians especially, were just really into that band. And I spent my first couple of years learning, teaching myself to play bass by playing along to Rush albums and a couple of Yes albums. So Geddy Lee and Chris Squire ended up being the biggest influences on my playing. Now, I did leave Rush in a way by the late 80s. I think I wasn't particularly into the later stuff, but I've always admired them, and especially how they wrapped up their career. Just one of the biggest bands ever. Um, so I don't
they're
know.
they're definitely cool. They're definitely cool, and the music is good. It's just not my thing, right?
No, I,
It's just not my thing. But I do like a lot of their songs. Like I mean, it's just that like I put on a playlist while we're doing a jigsaw puzzle in the kitchen, and we're listening to it, and it's like when it's all good, but there are only a few, maybe 1 out of 10 or whatever that I like. I like the vibe of it or whatever.
Farewell to Kings was probably one of my favorites, and then Hemispheres, which was the very next album, is definitely, that's my top favorite. If you put on some headphones and just check out how tight they play, it was just a killer, especially bass and drums. Uh, it's just locked in like I've never heard anybody ever be able to play like that together. Just super tight band.
It's amazing. Have you seen his TV show? Geddy Lee has a TV show, and he's
Oh,
asking the question about the bass. I forget what the question is, but he's basically asking, yeah, are bass players human? That's the question he asks. So he goes and interviews different famous bass players. He's a really cool guy, and he meets a lot of really interesting famous bass players. It's fun.
well, he and then of course there's this whole comedic aspect to he and Alex when those two are together. I've seen their beer commercials. Apparently they have their Rush beer now. I don't. I assume that was real, but they're hysterical. They're obviously drinking beer and doing a commercial,
Ha-
and they're just super funny guys.
have you seen Bob and not Bob and Doug's? No, it was yeah, Bob and Doug McKenzie up here in Canada. Have you seen that?
Yeah. Oh, I know about the Great White North. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Pretty cool. When I interviewed Stuart Goldrink from Gnitterlog, and he's the only other prog guy I've interviewed. That's why I keep referencing him. But I was thrilled, obviously, to meet him. He's like in his early 70s now. But all my favorite guys are dying off. You know what I mean? It's like because I'm into 70s prog. But I asked him about his favorite prog act, and he actually said one of my favorite prog acts. And I don't know what you're gonna say about this, but we both agree that it's the Bonzo Dog Band. Remember?
I don't.
You don't know? You don't know the Bonzo Dog Band?
I know nothing about
It's
that.
a novelty act with joke music. It's like silly, stupid music. Okay,
Okay.
and so they do all kinds of genres of music, but um, Viv, what's his name? Anyway, the guy's name is Vivian. I forget his name,
Okay.
but very talented and controversial man. He had his own TV show in England and stuff like that. But check out the Bonzo Dog Band
Okay.
if you haven't already. My friend at work, I work in construction. My friend's in a heavy metal band, like death
Mm.
metal, satanic metal, whatever, black metal. And he's very cautious of me because I'm Christian, I'm Catholic, and he just thinks it's weird. He doesn't think that we should see eye to eye, but we do. We start talking about music, and he told me, because when I told him that I'm into prog, he was surprised, and he said, "Well, I don't know, it wasn't him; it was someone else that told me that a lot of heavy metal people draw inspiration from prog music, in particular, because of the musicality of it and the
Right.
different experimentation." Had you heard that before?
Yes. Well, I was a heavy metal guy too, you know. Um, so yeah, I mean, I didn't really look at it as so much as progressive rock. It was all still rock back then. It was just, I don't remember what point we
Underground.
started.
They used to call it underground until after the fact.
So, I mean, you couldn't just get in a prog band, so I think, part of what put me into bands was heavy metal. I got into a power trio. So Rush was a big part of that when I was a kid. So because we sort of designed our band, I played synthesizers and bass. It looked like Rush, but we were into other things like Ted Nugent and um, Sabbath and Blue Oyster Cult and bands like that. So, but I would say I was definitely in a metal band, but I was always wanting to play in a prog rock band, and that opportunity didn't occur till for another 10 years or so. But everybody that I knew in those bands were into prog rock because it was amazing. It was intense stuff. Of course, there's a lot more to listen to of it now than there was then. But yeah, as far as musicianship went, those guys were the tops.
Yeah, I was surprised. I got a book. I've only read one book on prog rock, but it was sort of a history of it, and it was good. It was very interesting. They only really tackled the big names of rock, Jethro Tull, King Crimson, those sorts of things. I loved both those bands. But what I was surprised to learn was I knew about the jazz thing that's been
Yeah,
incorporated into prog. That's obvious.
yeah,
The classical thing, that's obvious, and of course blues-based prog bands. That's a thing. Pink Floyd, whatever. Um, but I was surprised to hear the strong influence of soul music on prog. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because my guy from Van der Graaf Generator, Peter Hamill, I mean, once he pointed it out in this book, I just realized, well, yeah, of course it's a soul influence, of course. So, what do you have to say about soul music?
I really couldn't comment on it other than I know, and this really, I don't know if it would apply or not, but I remember reading Chris Squire from Yes that some of his influences were Motown bass players. But as far as the music kind of leaking into the prog rock genre, I'm not too sure about that. I certainly hear metal and I certainly hear jazz and classical. And then there's this whole shred mentality that started in the early '90s, I guess, where it's just bewildering music, really. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know about the tie-in with soul.
Oh, there's another element to music I want to explore with you, and I heard some of it in some of your Glass Hammer, and I liked it. When I heard it, I liked it. It's
That's
the
good.
it's the folk element. I
Yeah.
love I love the folk element. So talk about that. Are there some bands that you used to like that were pure folk? Some prog that was folk influenced? What?
No, no, probably because the folk music thing. I mean, that was big probably when I was little. So that really didn't get into our music so much, but just the use of acoustic guitars for one. Bands like Heart. I'm trying to think of anything else that would have been an influence. Zeppelin. I mean, because there's some kind of folky stuff
Yeah.
going on with some of that acoustic music too from Zeppelin. Even Rush had acoustic sections, so all that music I was listening to must have sort of touched on that. Then we ended up doing a whole album, kind of acoustic, a Middle Earth album that's supposed to. Most of it takes place at the Prancing Pony in Bree, if you can imagine that. So one of the shows we did in Toronto was just that. It was just we had We had string players and acoustic, and that,
Cool.
played a bit. What was it we played? It was they had the premiere for The Return of the King, and they had a big Tolkien convention, and they rented out was it Medieval Nights, or what is that big,
The restaurant
re-
or
and redid a whole show based on Tolkien just for this one night, and we played. It was
wow.
crazy, pretty crazy, and it's very folky. Any of our prog fans that would have showed up wouldn't have known what was going on.
What about just a quick, yeah, go ahead.
I I think there was a lot of acoustic in that. Renaissance, Annie Haslam. I don't know if you're familiar with them too much.
Okay, I'll check that out. I'll check that out.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the lineup. Has it remained stable? Has it shifted over the years? What's with the lineup of
We're
Glastonbury?
well known for a shifting lineup. So it started off with Fred Schindel and myself and some musician friends, but it was our project, and then he and I stuck with it together, pretty solid up through. He's only on one song on the last album, but he and I kind of did all the production for the albums and wrote everything until recently. So, uh, and then we've had a number of singers. I owned a studio um, when I was in Chattanooga, and so we'd have all these killer musicians in all the time, and they would learn about what we were doing, and usually they'd get invited in and end up in the band for sometimes 10 years at a time. So a lot of the people I worked with were studio musicians. Lots of church vocalists ended up as singers for the band. So it's never really been steady, other than there'll be sort of a steady lineup for a few albums at a time, and then people's lives, we just drift apart and do our own thing. Aaron Ralston was our drummer for the last 10 years. So there's been some steady players, but uh, pretty much I've run the business with my wife, and that's what we are.
Very cool. Um, I don't know which album it was in King Crimson, but there was an album where they had this highly trained, eccentric percussionist that came right out of classical training, and he was very avant-garde. I mean, I'm sure we could take a guess at which album it was, one of the early albums, but um, I'm just wondering if you've had eccentric people come in and just add a bit of color to a set of albums and then just go on their merry way. This happens
Yeah,
in the history of rock a lot. So, can you
yeah.
think of anyone offhand that had sort of an eccentric take?
Uh, well, not so much an eccentric take. We've had, true classical musicians involved in the band, which was always fun, because they sort of could appreciate what we were doing from the outside looking in, I guess, and then invited to be a part of it, and it was a lot of fun. We had they were called the Adonia String Trio, and we used them on several albums. They were girls I went to church with. Um, that were in the local symphony, and then they had their own trio and they played weddings and that sort of thing. But we learned how to write scores for them, which was big fun for us. I was classically trained anyway, uh,
Ah,
but learning how to write a string part, and that album Culture of Ascent, they're on there, and
oh,
they're all Inconsolable Secret. I think they're all in that too.
wow.
And then they did some shows with us, which was where it got fun because they were still following scores, and you don't do that in a rock band. You might use a cheat sheet, which I do, just to kind of keep me on track. But we have this rehearsal situation where they were in the control room of the studio and we were downstairs in a bigger room, the band. So they're up there following their scores, and we're watching each other on closed circuit TV, and they're trying to play along. And at some point, one of them called me down, and they're like, "You added a measure there at number," and they'd want to refer to everything by measures. Like, could we go back to measure 88? Like, no, we can't. What verse is it? Um, but yeah, they're like, "You've added a measure." I'm like, "Yeah, we added a measure because we screwed up, and you've got to catch that." And what I think I taught them or tried to, was you can't do this with a score. You actually are going to have to go home and listen to the album and learn the song. First, learn the song. If you're playing in a rock band, anyway, you got to know the song.
It's
We'd had,
hilarious.
but there was another band that came in and we did an album with, and it was a jazz drummer, and he thought by numbers. He had to count everything. And we play in weird time signatures. It can be 11. It can be, lots of stuff in 7 and 5. And it, after enough practice, you don't think about anything. It's just, you're just playing a song. You're used to where the beat falls. But yeah, the more classically driven the person is, the harder it is to play not just regular rock, but progressive rock, because if a band makes a mistake, they're not going to stop and go back to measure 8/8. They're going to plow on. So it's fun. Anyway, they worked with us off and on for several years, and I think enjoyed it quite a bit.
Very cool, eye-opening. In this history of Prague that I read, I forget the author, but it it was a funny there was a funny anecdote where one of these prog rockers that had classical influence, he said, well, hey, I'm gonna score like a piece for orchestra. No
Yeah,
problem, no problem, right? And then he brought the orchestra in with his band, and they tried to play together, and everything was off, the timing was off. And then someone took him aside and said, well, when you score for an orchestra, you have to give us a bit of lead time, like you have to write in with it, you don't just put us on time, right?
right.
What's up with that? Like, why?
I don't know. We like I never played with a symphony ever, but I was a pianist, so I read music. I know about reading music, but by the time I was 17, I played with a drummer, and the drummer keeps the time, and the bass player, whoever the singer is, might cue that, might turn around. But we learned, I don't know if this probably won't answer your question, but there's a strange phenomenon that happens in Glass Hammer that probably happens in a lot of other bands, and it even happened a lot in the studio work. We can communicate, and my face seems to be virtually expressionless. We could communicate it with our eyes and just a nod of the head, uh, perfectly, so that at any point in the song we could, I mean, I can't even describe how it is. I could just look at my drummer, he could look at me, and maybe an eyebrow would move or something, but it meant something. And we never talked about it. They call it chemistry. Symphonies don't usually have chemistry. That's not what it's about. But rock bands like Rush, bands like that have to have that to function. We wrote scores for players, and they were able to adapt to it pretty well. It got crazy though, at uh, Belmont University in Nashville. We did a big show there with 125 singers. Now Nashville is a big music town, obviously, and they're all, they may be in the choir, but they're probably out front in a country band somewhere, or who knows what, trying to get a record deal. But we had 125 really cool young singers there, and they had scores, and what we scored, and I didn't do it by myself. I definitely had help from a good Catholic friend of mine. Mike Rumpsa helped with the scores, and his daughter. But they were taught to sing, or told to sing. There was one part of the choir that sang in Latin, one that sang in Tolkien's Elvish. We wrote that out, and English.
No
There's
Klingon, no Klingon.
no Klingon. They're singing it at the same time while we're playing something almost completely different. And this is in front of a crowd. And it was all going well and we went to their rehearsals, and it was beautiful. And if you hear all that, I turn you on to the recording. It's on Inconsolable Secret. I think it's on that version. It might be on just the live version. But we put them behind the drummer during the sound check, and that's where everything just about was a train wreck, because suddenly there's volume, there's bass, there's They couldn't hear from the monitors. They didn't know what they were doing. And it turned out great. There's some video of it out there if you can find it. We're actually at some point we're turned around. Everybody in the band basically is directing a section of the choir to get them through the song. We're nodding our heads, and it's just absolute chaos. And it worked. It worked. It was great. People were in the audience were crying. It sounded, but we were we were all about to have a fit. So I haven't tried that since then. I think, well, we did it one other time with the Lee College Choir, and since then I haven't been brave enough to go back down that road with an orchestra or anything like that.
Well, I like it. I like it when things kind of fall apart. I like
Oh,
that.
yeah, well, that's the thing about. I played in rock bands for years, and you could just. There was one band I was in that was so boring. Really, it was a top 40 band, and just to kind of be contrary, during our shows, I started reading a book. I could prop it up on my keyboard stand, and I'd play bass, and I'd just go over start to read, and they actually worked it into the show. Uh, and I was reading. It's so easy, but in a progressive rock band, it feels like it could all just crash and burn at any second. It's very
Delicate.
adventurous. Yeah, I
It's a
mean,
house of cards. House of cards.
we were basically a studio group. And when you bring that kind of a band out on stage, it's like, okay, we're going to try to be something we're not.
It's amazing. I was watching. So I got Gentle Giant, like a Giant on the Box, I think it's called.
Yeah,
And
those guys.
the reason I got it, the reason I got the DVD, I don't ever do this. The reason I did it is because it's so much fun watching them because they're having so much fun. Have you seen them live, at least in video?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Is it normal to have that much fun? Like they seem like they're really having fun.
If you do it enough, if you play enough, then it kind of all starts to just be second nature. Um, we all have muscle memory to be able to do this stuff, but when you're not concerned about the technical things, because that's a big part of it, because you're trying to run computers and hope your gear doesn't explode, and worried about what the guy in the third row is looking at, what's uh, and again, the faces that you see out front kind of dictate how you feel on stage too. So if they're smiling and they're having a good time, then it's pretty easy to have a good time. But I do know that with Glass Hammer, and again, because it was a studio band, and we would only come out now and then to do these shows, and they were always big shows. So it's not like we got to really warm up. We're in a studio for a year, and then suddenly we're in front of 1,000 people, uh, and we're on the bill with Yes or something like that. Then it's a little nerve wracking. So usually it'd be about the last 8 measures of the show where I would finally go, it's almost over. Try to enjoy it.
Was there ever an encore thing like, "Hey, play this song for us"?
Yeah, yeah. Now the worst of that happened in Canada, actually, where uh, in a lot of these prog shows, there are festivals, and you play for an hour or whatever they tell you, and you don't go over. So we got to the end of the set, and we didn't have an encore, and the place went nuts. And I can't remember exactly how it worked out, but I mean, I stood backstage for 10 minutes going, what am I going to do? And then the whole band's sweating. It's just been like a great show, killer show. And we got all these people just demanding in French that we come back and do another song. So we made them happy before it was over, but I can't remember exactly how it was crazy. Yeah, we do get encores.
Well, the reason I ask about the encores is because your music is so technical and you have so much music, such a large body of music, that I'm scared that you might not be up to date with practicing this or that particular song. Or do you know all the crowd pleasers? You got them all memorized completely?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we would, like, if we were going to do an hour and a half show, typically we would learn an hour and a half of music, and I might have us learn one other song as a stand, if things didn't work out on timing. and then we go out and we do that show in order, and we don't take requests.
Yeah.
And yeah, and when I in the position I was in, where I was kind of the road manager and everything else, I could learn an hour and a half music, and that was it. I couldn't do that plus keep up with everything else. It was a lot of strain, really, but a lot of fun to go out and meet people, meet our fans.
Um, Sort of as a break from music, literally, how do you get away from music if it's too much, you're saturated, it's like I don't want to think about music, I don't want to hear music, I just want to get away from music. Do you garden? Do you fly? What do you do?
Um, I read a lot, and um, I do listen to a lot of music, and it's not. I think when I was full time in the studio business, there wasn't a lot of time for me to enjoy music after working on it or doing audio stuff for 8 hours. That's the last thing I want to do is try to pull out an album and enjoy it. But I do that. I do listen to quite a bit of music, but other than that, I read. I used to like to hike. I'm trying to do some more of that. Then my wife and I hang out and watch TV and movies, and we go to the beach when we can, and that kind of stuff.
What about travel? Did you travel a lot with the band? And when you travel with the band, do you get to actually appreciate the culture that you visit? Like, for example, Quebec City, did you get to see some of the history?
Yeah. Fortunately, and we didn't travel a lot because we just didn't do very many shows. But we in Canada, for instance, there was a good fan there and a guy that was working with the festival that took us out for the day, or took two or three of us out and showed us everything. And it's kind of acted as a tour guide. Then same thing happened in Italy. We only had one show, but we were there, I guess, for 3. And one of the fans there happened to be kind of a curator, a historian, uh, worked for a big museum in northern Italy, and he was like our guy for 2 days straight. He took us everywhere and showed us everything, and was able to teach us about what we were seeing. So took us to the Alps and took us to the lakes, and so yeah, so we did on a trip like that. I got to really be there and kind of soak it up for a while. But so typical Glass Hammer, we went to Italy. We did the one show. We got on a plane. We came back home. So there was no tour. So we would always just wait till we were invited to do a festival that we thought we could get to that and do it well, and then we'd go do that show and come home. So it never really got to the point where it felt like a live band. So it was always a studio group.
One of my favorite non-English prog bands is PFM, the Italian.
Yeah,
What's the full name? Do you know how to say it?
but I either did a show with them or I saw them. I know I saw them in probably '97. I think they played out at, it was called Prog Fest in LA. I think '97, '98, something like that. I got to see them.
Cool, very cool.
I did a show with them, I think, at some point, but it might be that I just got to go see them.
Very cool. In the studio world, are there executives breathing down your neck and teams of lawyers and everyone's just stuffy and
Yeah,
controlling?
yeah. It wasn't ever so much in music; it would be in audio, because we did a lot of commercials. We did Super Bowl commercials one year, um, Volkswagen, and I did a lot of which Glass Hammer fans don't know this, but we worked on, I guess, 7 seasons, at least 7 seasons of Teen Mom for MTV, where the girl would come in and do all of her after audio stuff and narration. So in those cases, we always had those people on the phone. There'd be producers, and especially doing commercials. You'd have the legal on the phone, marketing, an ad agent, and they're all just, you know, everybody has to have their little piece of it. Change a word here, change, and the poor vocal or talent is in the booth trying to like listen to all these people, and it was,
For your albums, how many labels have you signed with over the years?
never.
No?
Nope, no, and I'm proud of it. We
Wow.
offered some deals early on, and then sort of in the middle period, maybe even around 2010 or so, we were offered again a couple of times. But I reached a point where, and had reached early on, having played in bands in the 80s, and dealing with managers and record companies, and had a pretty negative experience with most of it, and determined that I kind of wanted to be in charge of it. Um, that was the way I determined too that, like, when you're, especially in the 80s, it was all about getting signed. Everybody wanted to get signed, and that wasn't happening. And it certainly wasn't going to happen for a prog rock band. And I thought, well, I'll start a record company and sign myself if that's what it's going to take to make me feel good. Then that's what we'll do. And so I started the label, and just didn't never have really been tempted to do it any other way. This way, the success, if we have it, is ours. If there's a failure, there's not some manager that I can be mad at, that I can blame it on. You just have to take it. Uh, so I prefer it that way. I like to know what's happening. I like to know where the music's going, what the promo is doing, all that stuff.
Have you signed other artists to your label?
No,
Okay.
no,
Okay.
no. Tried to manage a group once, some years ago. Uh, One of the girls that ended up being our singer for many years had a band, and I thought I could do well at that, but this is not my cup of tea. So yeah, it's just one label, one band, and probably could have done that and could have branched out, but it's busy work, and it's enough work for me just to deal with this one thing.
Yeah. What about the album art? Where does that come from? Are you an artist, or do you know someone that is, or how do you get that?
I did a little art direction somewhat, but there's a guy named Michael. I pronounce his name Zay. It's Z, or excuse me, Xaay, Larank, from Poland. His father was a famous classical composer in Poland, and he's done everything for us since maybe 2013. So I stick with this one guy pretty much, and he's a band guy too. He's like a death metal band in Poland, but just a killer graphic artist, and lots of detail. Practically I guess any album you see from Ode to Echo on. I'm trying to think if there's one before that, would be his work.
Oh, wow. It's pretty cool. So, what's sort of what are some of the bullet points I didn't touch on? Like, 'cause you've done other interviews. I didn't watch them because I didn't want to learn about you. But you've done other interviews. What are some of the questions I didn't ask that I should have, and I'll regret not asking? What are some of the bullet points you want to touch on before we close out here?
Definitely, I do have a book that I'm pretty proud of, where I wrote my first. I call it Sword and Sorcery. It's kind of a sword and sorcery character in an epic fantasy world, and it's called Skallagrim in the Vales of Pagarna, and that's tied in with our album Dreaming City. And told you earlier, we did a whole trilogy based on this character. So I'd like people check that out if they're interested. I'm working on book 2 now, and then we just wrapped up this album, Arise,
Yeah.
that released like 2 months ago, and getting lots of great reviews. I've heard one or read one just today. Um, so that's really it. Just let people know to come to glasshammer.com when they can. We're also on Bandcamp and Amazon, and anywhere else you're going to find prog rock, you'll find us.
And I put your stephenbabb.com also, as well as theglasshammer.com, so people can pretty much get
Yeah,
to all your stuff from there, right?
yeah, yeah.
Amazing. So, I let my guest give the final thought. Usually it's a message of hope to anyone that's Christian, non-Christian, atheist, whatever, because I got a lot of different people listening to my podcast. What's just a sort of a general uplifting message of hope? Because humans don't always have hope, and that's a sad thing. There is suicide, there is war, there's lots of dark stuff. So, what's just a general uplifting message you could leave the listener with?
Well, I believe, and this is from a Christian, and so I believe Christ is the way, and the only way. That being said, if anybody is feeling hopeless and they're not sure about which way to go, I do have a firm belief in God, and I believe you can ask God to show you what you need to know, and he'll come through for you. So if there's something you don't understand about the world you're living in, talk to God about it, and I believe He listens. I do, again, want to point people toward Christ, because I think that's the key to it all. It seems crazy to some people, I guess, but once you're a Christian and you start to understand what that's about, it's the perfect way to make sense of the whole world. And I view everything I do through a Christian lens. But yeah, I think, and in believing in God, and this to me is hopeful too. He does love us, and he's he's in charge. Sometimes it may look really, really dark, and look really, really crazy, but I've read the end of the story, and it all works out. It all works out. It works out perfectly, as a matter of fact. So I would just ask people, look for God, and I think they'll find Christ along the way. Um, that would be important.
Excellent. Thank you so much. A pleasure meeting you. I can't believe that I got to talk to you. And
Yeah,
I hope you're gonna pray for me and mine. I pray for my guests, and I enroll each one of my guests in a perpetual mass. So even if you're not Catholic, the prayers of that Christian celebration, the remembrance of the passion and death of Christ, you're getting those prayers, you and your family, every day.
I,
So
thank you.
thank you so much for taking the time, and hopefully we'll talk again. Maybe later in the year, I'll give you a shout in a year's time or 6 months' time. See how you're doing.
Love it, man. Thanks a lot.
God bless you. Take good care.
All right, goodbye.